So I'll take you on a journey, but before we do that, I'll remove the top bar because that's always annoying. There we go. That should be better. Okay. So let's talk about what could be and what shouldn't be. Imagine 10 years from now, Europe is behind, as it is today, and we have failed to invest where we had to. And so therefore, not dissimilar to Africa before they adopted mobility, we are stuck, and we have to think about how we go forward. Now, because of that, a few companies are now in control of 7 billion humans on the planet through as-a-service layers. That's an issue because power is concentrated. And finally, only 2 states, or could be nations, have enough funding to allow universal basic income. Meanwhile, France, Germany, is going bankrupt because we don't have the means. We have not captured value so that we can enable citizens. So that is the problem we face. And how do we solve that? How do we become fully aware, implement the policies, the regulations, the open source perhaps, to actually prevent that scenario? So let's go back to 2024, eyes wide open. Let's be very, very, in complete awareness of what's going on. But before we do that, I'll bring you into my life, share my frustrations, tell you where I'm talking from. So the last 4 decades in tech, as far as I'm concerned, started here, 1981, with half a kilobyte of memory. Then I upgraded to 1 kilobyte of memory. Then this was 16 kilobyte of memory with a prompt. This was the prompt at the time. So some of you are old enough to remember. Then this is a slightly more advanced computer with 1 megabyte of memory with a graphical user interface. This is a next computer with 8 gigabyte of memory. And it's a fully fledged 32-bit computer with a Unix inside, BSD, right? So this is a graphical user interface in 1991. Now you would say, this looks like the Mac interface. In fact, it is very much the same build because it's been brought into Apple because Steve Jobs failed with this company, brought it back into Apple. And this interface is very much the same with the mail application, the Finder, and the dock. Now, you could look at this and say, oh, 30 years have passed. Not much has changed. Well, that is not quite true. In fact, I was building neural networks on this very machine 30 years ago. Didn't quite work. Speech recognition, shape recognition. But anyways, so advancement did occur. But meanwhile, I started working for DreamWorks in the US and then worked on Wall Street. Then I did an MBA at INSEAD, the business school in France, created a business plan, and then became an entrepreneur at the worst possible time. So that was my first company, my first check, 30,000 euros for ASP, Application Service Provider, now known as Software as a Service. So it's funny because the model for Software as a Service is only 20 years old, but it is part of the problem. I'll tell you why. Built an application studio for the App Store. Then I built a startup with proper funding, 1 million euro in funding plus 2.5. This was an application that was a better App Store. But I was dependent on Apple for it to survive. And Apple decided to kick us out in 2014. Right? So we were dependent. Today we could sue Apple because the regulation framework is preventing gatekeepers. Now, this was the case. This application was really popular, but we had to sell the company. I have the check in my pocket. I never cashed it. Right? So the startup life often means you get 0 at the end. It's quite frequent. This is a company that did well, relatively speaking. We raised a lot of money, and Sonos acquired the company. So now if you own a Sonos speaker, Snips, the technology, is inside for voice recognition, privacy by design. Very interesting. Then I was CEO at Scaleway, a regional European French cloud provider. But in a nutshell, if you've been following the sequence here, I've been competing with these companies for the past 20 years. And that is an issue. I did not create a big tech. You would know about it. Europe did not create a big tech. And that's an issue. These companies are so powerful. And I think Microsoft is a sponsor here today. We love them. These companies are great, actually. But they are too big for their own good, and they are too big for our own good in Europe. And my point of view is very much one of a European. So this is my new company, and I'll tell you more just after this. Now, I promise this will be a very quick 70 seconds history lesson. Again, some of you are very familiar. Computers 70 years ago were provided with humans inside because they were so complicated. And then you had to know how to punch cardboards, because that's how you programmed computers. And then you recognize these two guys, created Unix and the C language, I think. But then you could type, you had a printout, right? So every 10 years, the human-machine interaction improves. Here you get a terminal where what you type is directly rendered on the screen, even though the computing is centralized. Some of you remember this? Era of personal computers. This is a decade after as well. Typically the graphical user interface, which was the inspiration for the Mac, which was the inspiration for Windows. 10 years after, everything gets miniaturized. And guess what happens? Latecomer to the party, Apple again. Everything in one. Now, every 10 years, there is a paradigm shift in the way we interact with machines. Now, if we project on the future, it's how it goes, basically. It goes to people with PhDs to just about everyone. And we go from a world population of, say, 5, 10% to nearly 100% accessibility, which means every human on the planet is enabled through computing. And that is essential because what's interesting here is that in the past, interfaces were artificial. You had to bend yourself to the machine. Today, it's the reverse. Machines are bending to us. And they're becoming natural, less artificial. And to do that, lots of AI. Because AI is the perfect human-machine interaction layer, especially generative AI. But then we can talk about the greater category. So I'd like to talk about exponential technologies because it is important that we see what is going on. And I'm pretty sure all of you are well-trained, in control of the technology. You mastered it today. But I'm sorry to say, none of you, and not this collective group here, is able to follow what's going on because it is exponential. So, of course, you know the Moore's law, right? Moore's law means that we are on an exponential in terms of transistors in the chip. This law is basically plateauing now because we're reaching the limits in terms of nanometers inside the transistors layers. Now, scrap that. Moore's law, big data plus AI remains exponential. And let's call it high-tech. It's compounded with all these laws and all these improvements at every single layer. So we live in an era where technology is still exponential, or I would say even double exponential. The problem is we are made of flesh. And the law that defines the way we evolved is Darwinian. I've been in tech forever. You saw my track record. I don't, and same for you here in this audience, I'm pretty sure, you understand tech. You understand code. But I don't know about you, but I feel there's a tear in the fabric. It's really hard to follow, and society might not be able to cope, because not everyone is cabled like us. Now, you remember this quote from Mark Andreessen? Mark Andreessen created the Netscape browser, but he's also now one of the most powerful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. He said, software is eating the world in 2011. That's quite true, because if you look at the valuation of companies today in software, they're the ones who are actually growing the fastest. So that tagline is quite true. But then someone else said this, AI is eating software, or is going to eat software. Now, that turns out to be true as well, apparently. Especially if you look at anyone using cursor here, right? So interesting to see how AI is helping code, and code is rather easy compared to natural language. So Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, said that back then. So the logical inference is this: AI is going to eat the world. Well, not today, because today you must make this promise with me. We will not be eaten by AI. We need to control what's happening. So we need to fight back. How do we do that? First of all, so Stefano had a slide with a black box. I'm showing a white box here. AI is a large family of algorithms. And you don't need to have a PhD to understand what AI can do for you. So all these categories of problems can be solved with libraries that provide a sort of solution for each of these problems. So NLP has been around for a while. Gen AI actually accelerates NLP categories of problems, but it's just an algorithm. In fact, I would argue that AI is just software, right? We make a big fuss around AI, and it's important to define what is what, but actually, it is software. That is why the definition of open source remains super relevant. But again, it's important that everyone understands what AI can do for them, right? Which category? Machine learning, deep learning, what's the difference? Can I detect fraud? Can I actually build a recommendation engine? Can I actually facilitate human-machine interactions? The problem with AI and the exponential that I talked about earlier is this. You remember that DeepMind managed to create an algorithm that beat the world champion in Go. The thing is, humans are wrong, especially when it comes to exponential. We're built for linear analysis, not exponential analysis. This is a study that was done 6 years apart. 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, the estimation brackets by the very best scientists were in gray. They asked the same question a year ago, and it's the brackets in blue, which means that people got it wrong by a factor of 1, 2, or 3 decades. So things are accelerating. Things are coming sooner than even the best experts thought. In fact, for the Go challenge, the very best experts thought this was not going to be solved for another 10 years. So everyone was surprised. And guess what? Once the algorithm beats the world champion, using a lot of humans in the loop to train the algorithms and to create the very best possible autonomous algorithm. So the algorithm managed to beat the world champion, but it was not so sure, right? 6 weeks after, they created an algorithm that beat the algorithm that beat the world champion 100 games to 0, without human supervision. That's what I call double exponential, which means that we were wrong in the first place, but 6 weeks after, we were so wrong that it is a bit scary. So let's wrap it up. Software within which you have artificial intelligence, within which you have machine learning, within which you have deep learning, within which you have GPT. So GPT is interesting because it's a double sense, double meaning. Generative pre-trained transformers or general purpose technology. Perhaps it is the ultimate technology that aims to be this, which eats just about everything. So we have to be very careful here of what's happening. Let's talk about very big tech. Now, some of you perhaps remember this video. I will not do the dance. They understood something that very few companies have understood, that they need to talk to the people who actually do the code. But also, remember that Steve Ballmer said Linux is cancer. Well, sorry to say that Microsoft, Azure, I think 95% plus of their servers are running Linux today. So interesting to see how there is a combination of play called platform play. How do we do platform play? Now, these companies, a handful of them, I'm not putting Tesla because less interesting for us, but these companies are worth $12 trillion. And they have access to 5 billion humans. Now, let's upgrade this slide here. It's actually 15 trillion. NVIDIA just passed $3 trillion valuation. It's crazy, the numbers, that's a lot of zeros. And think about where we are in terms of budget in Europe. France is negotiating the budget because we're running a huge deficit. Germany is a little more structured, but Germany is also facing similar issues. So $15 trillion value creation, usually in the US, usually on the West Coast. Meanwhile, how do we capture value? So these companies are just reaping the benefits because they've created value capturing platforms. Now, let's look at the stack. This is a typical stack that goes from the hardware all the way to the software as a service. Let's zoom in again no offense to Microsoft, this is a great company, probably the best software company ever created in terms of business. I personally don't like their software, but in terms of business, they do well because it's integrated. And OpenAI, you could argue that it is a Microsoft company, right? Because they're running on Azure, and Microsoft owns a great deal of shares, not yet majority owner on purpose. But this stack here is incredibly powerful. And of course, they will do bundling because they sell everything together. Now, the other companies like Google and AWS, they try to do the same. So if you map, and again, I'm talking about cloud infrastructure, but I'm thinking AI. If you map these companies, so the US companies, they own 70% of the worldwide market for cloud. The Chinese companies are in the first tier, but there's nobody else. I mean, the 26% remaining, there's nobody in the first division. So US and China in the first division, Europe is not there. Now, if you map out the services provided by these companies, I think the perfect AI playground is here. Why? Because they provide the most advanced services, the most advanced layers, and they address 5 billion humans on the planet. Now, the two AI powerhouses are Microsoft and Google, because they go full stack, including B2C. So you could argue that Apple is also in the B2C layer, but they don't do B2B and they don't do IaaS and PaaS. So Apple is also a powerhouse. But in terms of being pretty much everywhere, these two companies are so big. And they make it so hard for the rest of us. Now, there's a bit of hype. There's a bit of overheating, if you wish. Some people are wondering if we can sustain this. 2 trillion market cap looking bubbly. Actually, we're at 3 now. So it's, we'll see. Are we going to be entering a new winter of AI? Now, some other examples are happening. If you look at the cloud, there are a lot of people thinking, you know, the infrastructure as a service or platform as a service is not sustainable. It's too costly. And here is the CTO of 37 Signal, the inventor of Rails, and he's basically saying, I'm off the cloud because it's too expensive. So there's a lot of thinking about, you know, should we go the way of big tech, the way they're selling us technology, or should we go back, take a step back, basically? Now, some companies will want internal data centers. That's a good thing, right? There is not one-size-fits-all model. Now, in terms of geopolitics, I have an issue with this picture, which was taken from The Economist, because where is Europe? It's actually nowhere. And in fact, here, Kai-Fu Lee, who's been around for a while, has known you know, deep tech, has known big tech. He said in 2018 that Europe was not going to be able to catch up. And I'm afraid he's right. In fact, if you look at this slide, NVIDIA sold 500,000 H100 chips in 2023. Scaleway, which is a company I worked for, announced in 2023 that they had the biggest European cluster of H100. That corresponds to 0.2% of the orders. If you consider that France has a 2 or 3% GDP footprint worldwide, then that's 10 times below where we should be. But Scaleway said it was for Europe. Europe is 18% GDP. So we're not there. And if you look at that sequence, Trump, America first, before Biden, COVID, where we realized we couldn't even build masks, the war from Russia against Ukraine at our borders, and Gen AI, that's a wake-up call. What are we going to do about it? So it's a sequence that could actually pursue with Trump too, because Trump is saying, America first against China. That's their policy. So they're letting Europe on its own. So if Europe is on its own, how do we actually fight back or at least be present in what's happening right now? So the what-if scenarios are multiple. We need to be fully aware of what's going on. So what if there's a conflict about Taiwan? The supply chain stops. In fact, during COVID, the supply chain stopped. The world is configured so that everything works well. What if it doesn't? South Korea is providing chips, memory chips. And the US is the natural ally for Europe. What if that stops? European singularity is great. this is a schematic view of the world: citizens, corporations, states. Now, the center of gravity is fairly central. Most nations, most advanced nations, provide pretty good conditions for humans. Most of us in advanced nations have access to a shelter, they sleep, they have breakfast, they go to work, and they have families, right? But there are slight differences, and I would argue that this actually what distinguishes the three. In China, the state dictates what happens. In the US, it's more corporations. In Europe, it's more citizens that are cared for. And we tend to forget that Europe actually was on the brink of collapse during World War II. So the US saved us from ourselves, but we're 80 years after. What are we going to do about it? Meanwhile, we've built an idealistic construct, which is wonderful. We care about citizens, and we have a balance that I think is more neutral, more central. So the AI Act is actually a good thing. It's a good thing because we think ahead for citizens. So what are the common European values? Democracy and Renaissance, welfare and healthcare, reliability and compliance, fashion, luxury, art de vivre, maybe for France, I don't know. I care about this: ethics, transparency, and trust, because trust is really, really hard to maintain, and it's easy to destroy. You know this quote from Arthur C. Clarke. Actually, that quote is misleading, because magic is the art of deceiving humans. We should not be enamored with technology that deceives us. And a lot of you are coders. Coders actually are able to deconstruct and reconstruct. That is precisely the definition of open source. You can deconstruct and reconstruct. You can inspect. You can build on. And so we should not fall in love with magical technologies. We need to understand it, because the way forward cannot be sustainable if we just take it for granted as a magical technology. So it has to be neutral and in check. And each of us is a decision maker, basically, while AI is eating the world. So this is my offering to you, which is that we need to look at these keywords as opportunities. And certainly, I've picked a few for the new project that I'm working on, based on reversibility, green computing, resilience, open source trust, and this is the project Probable, which is on the back of scikit-learn. So I'll take a few minutes before I wrap up to talk about European tech sovereignty. Again, how are we doing in terms of sovereignty? Again, European standpoint. The answer is we don't have tech sovereignty right now. Why? It's actually 1%. Let's be nice. 1% because if we look at France or Europe, we are buying, compared to what we need, 1% of technology that comes from, I'm talking digital technology, that comes from France. And for Europe, we're far below 18%. So if we're below these two numbers, we're sinking every year. So there are multiple levers that we can action to improve this, and open source is one of them. Or we can degrowth, we can go back to the woods, but I don't think that's what we like here. So degrowth is not acceptable to me. I think technology plays a role in shaping society going forward. So open source is the key. If you look at French tech, same thing in Germany, right? Was really boosted in 2010s. In the US, they started 7 generations ago. So they've been able to bring capital into the loop. Now, for every consolidation that happens, and this is actually a good recipe where we think unicorns and capital is helping companies build up, when are we going to have a big tech in Europe? That could be another 30 years. So meanwhile, there's this open source mindset, which has been around since the 70s. Remember IBM? Nobody ever got fired from choosing IBM. Why? Because this was the company all too powerful. And so people reacted. Open source is orthogonal to proprietary technology. And the two live together. So every decade, there's a new evolution. Open source, which was a framed version of free software. Then you had dual licenses and SSPLs and OCX. And now we have, very soon, the open source AI definition that we need, because we need that common language. Now, AI is wide open. Some of you perhaps know of scikit-learn. I knew of it, of course. I have no merit for scikit-learn. The scikit-learn is this open source technology that was incubated at INRIA for about 10 years. It generates nearly 900,000 dependencies on GitHub. It's been downloaded 1.5 billion times, ahead of PyTorch and TensorFlow combined. This is crazy. This is French. Most people don't know it's French and European. People take it for granted. And so scikit-learn is on this map. We didn't ask for it, but most of these logos on this map depend on scikit-learn. So this is one open source project that is fundamental to machine learning. And there was a good idea, actually. The French government sometimes has good ideas. And they decided to put money on the table and allow a spin-off to be created on the basis of scikit-learn, which was owned and controlled by a team at INRIA. So we transferred assets and co-founders, financing, and we are going to be building for the community, with a mission. So the company that I'm running today is a company with a mission baked into the bylaws. Our playground goes from knowledge graph all the way to MLOps, and the goal, the mission, is to build a complete suite of open source technologies for data scientists with a dual thinking, because we're a for-profit company. We're building new products on top of scikit-learn to generate profit, to sustain the mission. So that's the way we're building it. We're not doing like OpenAI that does a non-profit, which then gets eaten up by the for-profit. Right? We're doing it in a way that actually makes sense because the world is not waiting. And so commercial companies do make sense in terms of velocity. And the company has a very specific governance and shareholding structure. There is a raison d'être built into the bylaws. We are looking for 3 shareholding groups, very balanced. Public ownership, France, but I'm looking for people in Germany so that we can bring Germany also into the loop and other European countries. Private shareholding, and private shareholding is interesting because some people say they care for financial dividends. No, they care for performance, and that is always a good thing. And then co-founders and employees, right? So 1/3 protected for them. And then the governance is also balanced. And our DNA is the one that scikit-learn has given us. It's open, it's lean, it's tried and trusted. So of course we're doing the boring AI, not Gen AI, but a lot of it actually is out there in nature. So 14 co-founders, we're 30 people to date. We have 70 individual investors working from some of the very biggest companies, but they're people who understand AI. We're lucky to have the Mozilla Foundation, Mozilla Ventures as a shareholder, and France also. And business model-wise, I'll zip through it quickly. So the core inspiration is Red Hat, because we think Red Hat is a company that added value to Linux. Other companies have been a little more tricky, right? So the way we're doing this is that we are a software company with A and F activities. The open source library, we're not touching the license at all. So we are maintaining this. We have 10 people focused on scikit-learn that only do that. We compensate the cost of the open source libraries with library sponsorship. Then we have professional services that we've started. Certification and training, we're launching at the end of the month the very first official scikit-learn certification program in the world. Support services we have not started, and we're building a new product to help data scientists in companies make the best of their work in the pre-MLOps phase. So this is us. Thank you.
Thank you, Yann. I very appreciate that there is some optimism at the end of your presentation, because